Hi, everyone. All right, we're back with Hannah Arendt on violence. We're looking at the second section of this book. And what Arendt is most interested in the second section is making a distinction between power and violence. And she's going to do this by relying on um, her own conception of what politics is or should be. Uh, right, Arendt is throughout the 20th century. Arendt was sort of developing a concept of the political that ran counter to sort of standard understanding of politics in the 20th century. And her concept of the political, in addition to being informed by her experiences in Nazi Germany and her thinking about totalitarianism, is also informed by the ancient Greek concept of politics, the ancient Greek concept of democracy, and her sort of theory of uh, how politics emerged and what purpose it serves. So, in making this distinction between power and violence, she wants ultimately to make the argument for why violence is not a productive political strategy. Now, she begins by talking about the sort of standard understanding of what violence in politics is, or how violence is used in politics. And in general, right, she begins by saying that generally people imagine that violence is nothing more than the most flagrant manifestation of power, she says on page 35. Right? Quoting Max Weber, she writes, the definition of the state as the rule of men over men based on the means of legitimate, that is, allegedly legitimate violence. So, how does the state get its power? That is to say, where does political power originate from? Where does power of any kind originate from? And standard answer is that power originates from violence. That power is the consequence of having the power to do violence. One has power when one has power to do violence. So we might, think about where does the power of the law come from, for example? Why are laws obeyed? Or why is the law created, obeyed, followed? Why are there laws? Generally, we'd say, or one might certainly be tempted to say, and it sort of makes intuitive sense, that we'd say, well, the laws are followed because not following the laws would mean inviting violence against yourself. Right? If you don't follow the law, you'll be thrown in prison, or even possibly worse. Right? If you resist arrest, if you resist going to prison, ultimately the state will use violence against you. Right? Violence is the most extreme, most flagrant manifestation of power. Why do we all go along with the state? Why do we all go along with politics? Because if we don't, there's the threat of violence. So power, we might think, is established by violence, and where violence is absent from power, it is always in the background as a possible threat, right? What makes a person, an individual, powerful? According to this theory, it would be the ability to do violence, right? The fear that the powerful person will do violence to you. Now, Arendt says this is an interesting theory of the relation between power and violence because it assumes that the state is essentially uh, an oppressive force. To equate political power, she writes on page 36, with the organization of violence, right, makes sense only if one follows Marx's estimate of the state as an instrument of oppression in the hands of the ruling class. So if we think that the power of the state comes from the threat of violence if power is not obeyed, then we have to understand the state as essentially an oppressive force, right? The laws are oppressive, and we tolerate this oppression. We follow the laws only for fear that if we don't, there will be violence backing up those laws. Now, we might understand the state as simply a force of oppression, but this is not going to be Arendt's concept of the state. Right? The state is not just a force of oppression, and where it acts as a force of oppression, it is abusing its power. Right? So she asks an interesting question, right? Would the disappearance of violence in relationships between states spell the end of power? In the absence of violence, would there no longer be any power? Does power derive only from violence? And she writes, the answer, it seems, will depend on what we understand by power. Power, it turns out, is an instrument of rule, while rule, we are told, owes its existence to the instinct of domination. So power is an instrument of rule. Power and rule are related. And rule, according to one theory, is the instinct to dominate. Okay, so this is a kind of continuation of this theory that power is derived from violence. Power is rule, rule is domination, domination is violence. And she continues an analysis of a number of thinkers who have thought this way: Voltaire, Clausewitz, and others. Right? But she's interested in an alternative. She finds an alternative in this a different French philosopher, Alexandre Passerin d'Entrevent, Passerin d'Entrèves, who distinguishes between violence and power. Now, she writes, while the authors quoted above define violence as the most flagrant manifestation of power, Passerin d'Entrèves defines power as a kind of mitigated violence. This is still not good enough for Arendt, but it provides a reversal of the causal structure. Right? Power is derived from violence, according to the traditional view. Antrev argues that power is mitigated violence, that power is the phenomenon that uh, allows violence to be lessened. Right? Where there is power, there is less need for violence. But in this case, power will still require violence. Power only appears uh, in order to mitigate violence. Right? It's kind of antidote to violence. So she says, in the final analysis, this comes to the same. Right? Whether we conceive of power as being directly derived from violence or power as that which arises in order to mitigate violence, in order to provide a kind of alternative to violence, we're still understanding power only in relation to violence. Now, this leads to some interesting reflections, and I want to just mention one of these, right? Which is, and she's discussing the nature of power and the nature of violence, right? Which are the forces of violence that hold power? Uh, Generally, right, absolute power is connected to military power. And so the seat of power lies with the absolute monarch in monarchy prior to the democratic revolutions. And right, that power certainly appears to be derived from the army. Arendt has a different idea about that we'll see in just a moment. But interestingly, she says, today we ought to add the latest and most perhaps formidable form of such domination, bureaucracy, or the rule of an intricate system of bureaus in which no men, neither one nor the best, neither the few nor the many, can be held responsible, and which could properly be called rule by nobody. So the reason why we might associate power and violence today is that the seat of power is obscure. Right? Where power actually resides is obscure. And so we are sort of in the same way that in the medieval age we might have equated the power of the monarch with the power of the military. Today we might equate the power of bureaucracy with the power of the military. And it's the bureaucracy that has the ability to dominate, right? And this is where the sort of sense of politics as oppression, politics as domination comes from. Why in contemporary America, in 20th century America, we might understand politics as domination, because there's a kind of tyranny of bureaucracy, a rule by nobody. And for Arendt, this is and sort of abdication of true power and what power ought to be, right? Because power should be capable of being held responsible, uh, right? What makes the monarchy uh, more legitimate, even than the domination of bureaucracy, is that the king, the queen, can be held accountable for how the monarchy is doing. By contrast, in a bureaucracy, there's no one who can be held to account. So the power of domination is even stronger. And wherever politics equates to domination, it's reasonable to equate power with violence, or certainly tempting. uh, Now, this need for accountability when it comes to power is enormously important because ultimately it is accountability uh, from which power derives. Right? Power comes from not violence, according to Arendt, but from accountability, right? From the ability to invest power in a particular individual or body, a representative. Right? This is the key. Power is derived from representation. An individual represents a group. That's where their power comes from. And hence, the individual who holds power has to be accountable to that group in order for that power to actually function, in order for it to actually be powerful. Now, power has many facets. How does power function? We've already seen one possibility. Right? Power functions through violence. What makes someone powerful is the ability to do violence. However, this is not going to be the case for Arendt. Power instead is going to be derived from uh, accountability, right? From the legitimacy of the person holding power, of the right of the powerful person to hold power. And so this legitimacy is not enforced through violence, but again, through the legitimate representation of a group. Uh, and so this makes the operation of power rely not on violence, but instead on the ability to command or the power to make others obey. The power to make others obey is very different or is a much larger power than the power to dominate. Right? Domination is achieved through a kind of violence. Right? I dominate means that you do as I say because you're afraid of violence. And certainly, right, if you are afraid that I will do violence to you, you will likely obey me, follow my commands. But it's also possible to command and to be obeyed, not through the threat of violence, but through the authority of one's power. Right? So this question of domination, of command and obey and obedience, are crucial to power. Right? So she writes. The more modern scientific and philosophical convictions concerning man's nature have further strengthened these legal and political traditions. The many recent discoveries of an inborn instinct of domination and an innate aggressiveness in the human animal were preceded by very similar philosophical statements. According to John Stuart Mill, the first lesson of civilization is that of obedience, and he speaks of the two states of the inclinations. One, the desire to exercise power over others, the other, disinclination to have power exercised over themselves. If we would trust our own experiences in these matters, we should know that the instinct of submission, an ardent desire to obey and be ruled by some strong man, is at least as prominent in human psychology as the will to power, and politically, perhaps more relevant. Uh, so, what she's discussing here is this idea of domination. There's this sort of concept in modern philosophy, 20th century philosophy, and we still see this a lot today, that there is a kind of inherent aggressiveness in human beings, and that politics is an expression of this inherent aggressiveness. Uh, and ultimately, politics is the attempt to uh, mediate this inherent aggressiveness, this urge to violence, what Freud, for example, called the death drive. In one of Freud's books, Civilization and Its Discontents, he makes this argument really explicit. The goal of society is to mitigate the inherent, innate urge to violence, instinct to violence, the inherent animalistic, instinctive aggressiveness of human beings. And Arendt is going to question this, right? Well, it's true that there is a kind of inherent aggressiveness, sure, but there's also an inherent uh, urge to submission and an urge to obey, right? That aggressiveness and obedience are equally sort of innate and inherent in human beings. To say that there is inherent aggressiveness doesn't explain politics, right? That is too simple an explanation. Now, she goes on, right? Conversely, a strong disinclination to obey is often accompanied by an equally strong disinclination to dominate and command. Uh, Now, it seems what she's setting up here is a sort of set of dichotomies. Right? There is an impulse among humans to dominate. There's also an impulse to submit. But there are also those who have a disinclination to obey or submit. And among those who are disinclined to obey, there's also a disinclination to dominate and command. Right? Uh, so let's read how she concludes this. If it were true that nothing is sweeter than to give commands and to rule others, the master would never have left his household. All right. So that was a little bit of a disorganized set of quotations, but let me try and zoom out a little bit and explain what Arendt is getting at here. If politics is simply about domination, then there would be no need for politics. Domination is something that occurs outside the political realm. Domination is found in the household. Domination is found in the social world. Certainly, domination can exist in the realm of politics, but it's not proper to the realm of politics. Politics, in itself, by definition, exists as a kind of respite from the domination of the private and social realms. So, in order to explain this, I have to go into a little bit of Arendt's larger political theory. For Arendt, there are three realms of human existence. There is the private realm, the social realm, and the political realm. In the private realm, human beings are what she calls homo laborans. Uh, this is human being in uh, sort of survival mode with nothing but the bare necessities. Uh, it is where we, um, in the private realm, is where we raise families, where we farm the land, uh, where we build our private house and survive. Right? It's the home life, family, and making a living, survival. That's the private realm. Right? I can live my whole life in just the private realm. I can have my family, I can grow my crops, and I can never interact with anyone outside of my home. I would be an entirely private individual. However, right, I am also capable of extending myself beyond just my home, my private life, of making friends, of socializing. And I can invite the neighbors over for dinner. And I can even trade some of my crop with the neighbor. Maybe the neighbor is a blacksmith, and I trade some of my, wheat for a new scythe, right? Something like that. This is all right in sort of prehistory, imagining the original conditions under which politics emerges. In this social realm, I am part of a larger world. Right? My world includes my neighbors, includes my son-in-law, it includes the people I trade with, the people I socialize with, etc. Right? In this realm, Arendt says, we are homo faber. We are not just laboring for our own survival, but we're creating, right? We're fabricating things. We're fabricating a world. And so we would trade, we would socialize. We have a world of our own outside the home. Now, in this realm, right, it would be possible to have relations of domination between households. Right? In my social world, maybe my neighbor, who I've been friends with, comes and takes my house, sleeps with my wife, steals my crops, all of these things, right? Does me some injustice. The social world doesn't have the means of dealing with this kind of situation, right? In order to deal with this sort of problem, we need to rise to yet a higher level. Right? In the social realm, when my neighbor does me an injustice, my neighbor is dominating me, right? They're stronger than I am. They're more charismatic, whatever. Right? They have the power to dominate me. Now, maybe it's true that I am able to fight back, and I get some other neighbors to band together with me, and we go and confront this this bully, right? This neighbor who's stealing and doing injustice, and maybe we kill this neighbor, right? Problem solved, perhaps, but only for a time, right? Until the next neighbor decides they want to dominate. And so we're able at the social level to band together and fight one another, and temporarily deal with injustices. However, things change uh, when we band together not just to fight some dominating neighbor, but when we get together and say we need to establish rules that will prevent any one of our neighbors, anyone in our social world, from doing injustice. Uh, we can't simply, anytime there is an injustice, band together and do harm to this neighbor, this bad neighbor. We need to establish a set of rules uh, that will prevent things from getting that ugly. We need to create civil society. And this realm of existence, this final stage in sort of social development, is the political realm, which corresponds to what Arendt calls the vita activa, or the vita contemplativa, the active life, the contemplative life, where we are not laboring for survival nor creating a social world, but we are acting collectively to decide the principles and rules that will govern all of us. So we can see that at the political level, for Arendt, there is no possibility for domination. Politics, theoretically, is about organizing a group in such a way that domination by one or by a faction of that group is impossible. Politics is, according to Arendt, definitionally opposed to domination. And so when she says, if it's true that nothing is sweeter than to give commands and to rule others, the master would never have left his household. If politics was established in order to create domination, in order to dominate, then politics would have been entirely redundant and unnecessary. There would never have been a need for politics had the goal of politics merely been domination. Any politics of domination is a usurpation of politics. So, the master, that is to say, the ruler in a political context, is not a master in the sense of a dominator, or a ruler in the sense of a dominator. And rules themselves are not about domination. They're precisely the opposite. Right? The rules of civil society, the rules of politics, and the leaders in politics should have power precisely because they are opposed to domination, opposed to violence. So, this explains also how power is based not in violence, but in authority, the authority to command, and the ability to be obeyed. And it explains why power is based in, as Arendt says, not violence, but opinion. This is a fascinating claim that she makes, that power is based ultimately in opinion. On page 49, she says, the question of this obedience is not decided by the command obedience relation, but by opinion, and of course by the number of those who share it. It's not that one obeys because one is afraid of power, of violence. One obeys because one has consented to invest the powerful person with power. Right? Even if I, as an individual, disagree with what the person in power is commanding me to do, I will obey because I have agreed to a larger contract. Right? This is essentially an articulation of the social contract. I have agreed to participate in the political realm. And in the political realm, I defer to, in the case of a democracy, the opinion of the majority. I agree to be ruled by the majority because this is the political system in place to prevent domination, right? Usurpation of politics. So this power rests on opinion. Forgive me. All right, so let's look at these distinctions a little bit more closely. Arendt wants to distinguish between uh, 5 things: power, strength, force, authority, and violence. We've talked a little bit about this larger political framework. And so it will make sense, hopefully, when she says power on page 44. Power corresponds to the human ability not just to act, but to act in concert. Power is never the property of an individual. It belongs to a group and remains in existence only so long as the group keeps together. Power is inherently political. Power is collective action. Why does power rely on authority rather than violence? Because power is invested in an individual by a group. Now, this in itself derives from the original situation in which politics emerges. Right? Why is it not the violent one who gets political control? How can power overcome violence? And I think that Arendt's argument gets a little bit more complicated here than she lets on. Because ultimately, what makes power power is the fact that a group can always overpower an individual. So that the reason why power is greater than violence seems to ultimately be that no individual, no matter how strong or violent, has the ability to overcome a group. Now, why not? Ultimately, it will be because the group has the ability to do greater violence to the individual. A very strong individual who might be able to kill any other individual in a one-to-one fight can always, no matter how strong the individual is, be overcome by a group of individuals. There's no individual that is stronger than a group of individuals, even if the members of that group are very weak. So it seems as though violence is still the arbiter. But here's what I think saves Arendt's argument and point, that power, the power to overcome the violent individual, is not itself based in violence. It's a response to violence, and it might use violence in order to fight violence. But the source of the power that's able to overcome the violent individual is agreement, right? We get a group together and we all agree we have to band together against that violent individual. So power comes from speech, comes from persuasion, agreement, comes from collective action in the sense of agreeing to band together. So while violence may be the sort of catalyst for the creation of power, what actually causes power to be created is discussion, speech, agreement, collective action. So again, also, this is why opinion is going to be the foundation of power. Because no power is based on agreement. It's my opinion that we should band together against that violent individual. What will likely happen is that group that has agreed to work together against the individual invests the power of the group in a representative individual. That representative individual will speak for the group and thus will be the leader of the group. You might say the master of that group, but with the recognition that it's not the power of the representative over those represented that gives the representative power. It is those represented who give the representative power. So the leader of this group, this political group, is not powerful in his own right, but only by virtue of the agreement of the collective. So the group, the individual speaks for the group, power derives from the group, and the power of that individual is based on the opinion of the group. So let me just step back for a minute and think about this a little bit more. This is something that I think we have been seeing firsthand, right? In this country a lot recently, and I'll just note that Arendt says, right, all political institutions are manifestations and materializations of power. They petrify and decay as soon as the living power of the people ceases to uphold them. The fact that power is based in opinion means that those representatives who present themselves as having power by virtue of representing uh, the collective only have real power to the extent that the people actually support them. So there's been a lot of discussion over the last 4 years or so about norms and institutions and sort of anxiety and fear about uh, right. I mean, to put it bluntly, whether or not the institutions of American power could withstand, uh, Donald Trump's vision of American democracy. I don't want to wade into this too much, but I do want to go back and think about uh, the the insurrection, the attack on the Capitol, January 6th. I think that's an interesting example of this because in our last video, we were talking about how absurd the idea of a revolution against the American military would be. And that's true, provided that those in charge of the American military hold real power, which is to say, actually uh, have the favor of the people. It's actually the people's opinion that those in power should have power. What compels the military to fight on behalf of the US government? Certainly the Constitution, certainly the laws, certainly tradition and norms. But at the end of the day, it comes down to whether or not the individuals who are actually acting on behalf of the Constitution still believe in the Constitution, whether or not it's still their opinion that the Constitution uh, binds them in the way that those in power say. Right? In other words, what I'm trying to get at is it's true that if everything works the way it's supposed to work, an attack on the Capitol would be absurd because there's no competing against the power of violence of the US military. However, there is the potential to fight against the political power of those in government. And if it's revealed that those in government don't have real political power, then nothing is stopping, for example, the generals from deciding that they are more represented by the revolutionaries, by a new seat of power, a new agreement, than the old one. In other words, if I walk into the Capitol building and I declare myself king for life, everything in the US Constitution says I should be tried for treason. But if everyone agrees with me, then it doesn't matter what the Constitution says. If the military generals agree with me, I don't have to worry about fighting the military. So it is never the case that some rule has power, that an institution has power. It's only ever people that have power. And so when we expect or think that we can make an argument about how politics ought to be based on some mechanical argument, right? For example, the Constitution says it has to be XYZ way. We're always failing to assert our own power. Power ultimately lies in the people. That's ultimately Arendt's major point. Right. All right. Well, I'll come back to that and try and say that better, because Arendt says that in just a moment. But let's keep going with our distinctions here. And so power corresponds to the ability to act in concert. Power is never the property of an individual. It belongs to a group, right? Power cannot belong to an individual. Strength belongs to an individual. You can have a strong individual, but not a powerful individual. Any individual that thinks they're powerful has misunderstood where their power comes from. Force, Arendt thinks, should be understood as a kind of non-intentional movement, right? Physical forces, forces of circumstances, physical and social forces, things that produce movement. So, for example, we might talk about the force of racism or sexism, the force of greed, the force of the ocean. Right? These are things that drive us, that shape us, but which are not, properly speaking, part of the calculation when it comes to action. How do we act? We don't. Force is not a product of our action. And then finally, not finally, but importantly, we get authority. Right? Authority is, as we've discussed, right, something that comes from the investment of power in an individual by a group. And Arendt has interesting things to say about where authority ultimately comes from, right? Authority is based on the initial founding of a political group, right? So let's see if we can find this section on authority. uh, Authority is going to be um, similar to legitimacy. One has authority when one is vested with power. I am the president. I have authority. I am the chair of the board. I am the head of the department. Right? A group has invested me with power, and that group can take power away from me if they so choose. It's not my power as an individual. I have power. I have authority. Right? Authority is what allows me to issue commands and what compels you to obey. So authority is essential to power, but there will be legitimate and illegitimate authorities, legitimate and illegitimate forms of power. Right? Once power is invested in an individual, the individual becomes an authority, and the authority can then be used legitimately or illegitimately. Right? How we will judge the legitimacy of the use of power is going to be based on, as she says on page 52, power springs up whenever people get together and act in concert, but it derives its legitimacy from the initial getting together rather than from any action that then may follow. Legitimacy, when challenged, bases itself on an appeal to the past. So, how do I justify the legitimacy of my authority, the legitimacy of my act as an authority figure? I will have to appeal to the past. And this is where the Constitution does become important, right? Is this a legitimate use of power, of authority? Can the authority use power this way? Well, we'll have to go back and look at the foundation of the political group that has vested this individual with power. Right? And so the Constitution as a foundational document would be sort of the place to look for legitimacy. Right? Can I legitimately argue that this is constitutional? You know, we can think of this in simpler forms, right? When you start a a band with your friends or whatever, and you start a company, right? Let's say you drop a mission statement, and you say, okay, I've been made chair of the board. You've vested me with power. I have authority. I'm saying a legitimate thing for this company to do is to branch out from making batteries to now make cell phones. Right? Is this a legitimate move? Does this make sense? Can I argue that this is what we ought to do? Well, I'd go back and look at the mission statements, and we could, if someone says this is not what we were meant to be, right? This is an illegitimate use of power. You're abusing your power as an authority figure. You go back and say, look, it says right here in the mission statement where we deal with anything having to do with electronics or something like that. Right? So you would base your argument in your founding document, just as in the political realm, you would have to go back and make an argument based on the Constitution. Now, this also is going to set certain limits for what can be done within a particular political arrangement and political group, right? So if we say, the Constitution clearly says that it is illegitimate for an authority figure to throw out the results of an election, right? What if we can't come to an agreement on what the Constitution says in that case? Well, then it's entirely possible that the usefulness of that founding document has run out, right? If by returning to the foundation of the political group, by making appeals to those founding ideas, the founding agreement to work together, if that no longer secures legitimacy, then the legitimacy of the entire political group, the entire political system, is suspect, right? Is doubtful. As she says, right? It belongs to a group and remains in existence only so long as the group keeps itself together. If we no longer can agree on what made us a group in the first place, we can no longer agree on what that founding document means, then we're no longer a group. And we can't act as though we are politically unified. So, authority, right? Very important. And then finally, right, her last distinction is violence. And as we've seen, right, violence is determined by its implemental nature. It is an implement. Um, it represents a world. And in the last video, I was speaking about violence as though it required tools. And I think that that's legitimate insofar as violence belongs to the world and is instrumental in the sense that it always seeks some goal or purpose, and insofar as it works in that means ends matrix, it belongs to a specific world. But what Arendt meant is that violence is always used in order to attain some end or purpose. And in that sense, it's always going to be subordinate um, to a political goal. Violence is not in itself political, but is subordinate to political goals. So all of these things, right, are distinct. And what Arendt is worried about is that they have been confused, right? That we don't know the difference between power, violence, and authority. And we see this, she says, in the way that we use power. Right? The way that we use power as though it were synonymous with violence, and violence as though it were synonymous with power. So, for example, right, she talks about Vietnam. In a contest of violence against violence, the superiority of the government has always been absolute. Right? But this superiority lasts only as long as the power structure of the government is intact. That is, as long as commands are obeyed and the army or police forces are prepared to use their weapons. When this is no longer the case, the situation changes abruptly. Not only is the rebellion not put down, but the arms themselves change hands, sometimes, as in the Hungarian Revolution, within a few hours. So, if we think that superior capacity for violence is enough to secure political power, we are gravely mistaken, right? And this is, I think, the real danger that Arendt is working on here. Right? I mentioned this at the end of the last video. The danger is we will think as long as we have the capacity to do unspeakable violence, our power is secure. When in fact, by believing that power resides in violence rather than in opinion, uh, what is in danger of happening is that opinion will shift, that power will suddenly no longer rest in the hands of the government, but will lie with the people. If the government stops genuinely representing the people, stops uh, protecting the people from domination, and becomes a force of domination, which Arendt seems to think uh, is happening in the United States even in the 1960s and 1970s, then what might happen is not that the government will use enormous violence against the people, but that the implements of violence will be transferred to where power actually lies, to the people. So that a coup in any government is absolutely possible, provided that that coup has real power, regardless of their capacity for violence. That's irrelevant. If they have real power, then they can accomplish a coup. Because, right, they will have authority. They will have the authority to command. That when, you know, those in government command the military to use violence against the revolutionaries, that command will no longer have power behind it and can be ignored. Doesn't have to be obeyed. And so the military, those with the instruments of violence supposedly on the side of the state, would switch sides, right? Would be more willing to listen to a command from the rebels than a command from those supposedly in power, those that call themselves authorities. Now, what's the takeaway from this? For one thing, obviously, that building weapons arsenals uh, and stockpiling instruments of violence is no guarantee of power whatsoever. That power and the potential for power to maintain itself comes only through political discussion, through consensus building, and through the cultivation of consent and opinion. Right. So now we return again, page 49, where we read, "The question of this obedience is not decided by the command-obedience relation, the chain of command, but by opinion, and of course by the number of those who share it. Everything depends on the power behind the violence. The sudden dramatic breakdown of power that ushers in revolutions reveals in a flash how civil disobedience is but the outward manifestation of support and consent." So this is another important point, right? That this is why nonviolent protest is so much more powerful than violent protest. Because nonviolent protest is about building power. uh, is about building power, whereas violent protest can only be about destroying power. To build power means to persuade. Uh, Moreover, it shows that nonviolent protest, even when it's breaking the laws, is working uh, in the broader system that authorizes, legitimizes, and gives authority, authorizes those laws. So, let's think about just a few more points toward the end of this. On page 50, she writes, no government exclusively based on the means of violence has ever existed. It is impossible to found a government on violence. Even the totalitarian ruler, whose chief instrument of rule is torture, needs a power basis, the secret police and its net of informers. And then, so this is in keeping with everything she's been saying, right? Power is not based on violence. You can't have a government based just on violence. But then she says something interesting. Only the development of robot soldiers, which, as previously mentioned, would eliminate the human factor completely and conceivably permit one man with a push of a button to destroy whomever he pleases, could change this fundamental ascendancy of power over violence. Even the most despotic domination we know of, the rule of master over slaves, who always outnumbered them, did not rest on superior means of coercion as such, but on superior organization of power, that is, on the organized solidarity of the masters. So even in slavery, which seems to be absolute domination, there is still a power basis. Even in totalitarianism, which seems to be based on violence, there's still a power basis. Right? There is the right society of slaveholders. There is the cabal of secret police that reaffirms the power of the totalitarian leader. The only potential for overcoming this relationship between power and violence lies in technology, lies specifically, she says, in robot soldiers. And we might also think of nuclear weapons again, right? And in this scenario, right, there would be sufficient capacity for violence at the disposal of one individual that most original political situation in which the many can outnumber and overpower any individual, no matter how strong or violent, is overturned and erased. And what we're thinking about here is an absolute reset in the dynamics of power and violence, and presumably also in authority and obedience. So that technology, specifically robot soldiers, which I would mention are very much real in today's world, make it conceivable that one individual would be able to permanently rule over all people. Now, we'd have to game this out a little bit, right? Can any individual really act so entirely independently? Could any one individual summon the power to do that kind of violence? Right? These are the kinds of questions that we'd ask. But the important thing is to recognize that, again, at the founding moment of political power, violence is already present. And to change the dynamics of violence in this way through technology has the potential to fundamentally transform what politics has the possibility of being. Um, so, this then brings us to the question of the use of violence by power. Power is not based on violence, but power certainly uses violence. Uh, on page 52, in the same section where she talks about legitimacy and the return to the past, she also talks about what makes the use of violence by power justifiable. The important distinction she wants to make here is that violence, when used by power, might be justified, but it will never be legitimate. Why? Because, remember, legitimacy of power comes from an appeal to the foundation of that power. And the foundation of that power will always be based in the eradication of violence and domination, a collective act to prevent the domination of the group by an individual. So it will never be the legitimate purpose of power to do violence, but violence can be justified in order to protect the basis of power. And Arendt doesn't have much to say about in which cases violence is justifiable. But she does say that justification depends on the immediacy of the threat. Violence, she writes on page 52, can be justified, but it will never be legitimate. Its justification loses in plausibility the farther its intended end recedes into the future. Its justification loses in plausibility the farther its intended end recedes into the future. No one questions the use of violence in self-defense because the danger is not only clear but also present. And the end justifying the means is immediate. Right? So what this means is, right, I justify violence in order to achieve some end, some goal. Right? Violence is a means to an end. Now, the goal that I seek to attain with that violence must be immediate. I'm justified to use violence provided that the purpose of that violence, we might say the product of that violence, is immediately reaped. Right? So, for example, right, the example she uses, self-defense. It is justifiable to do violence to someone else if they are in the process of attacking you. Right? If someone comes into your apartment and rushes you with a knife, you can shoot them justifiably. Right? The threat is immediate, and the use of violence instantaneously brings about its intended goal. And we can say that was justified. Right? We can see the product of that violence and judge it. However, if I say, I think my neighbor in 10 years or so is going to kill me, right? for whatever reason, right? Whatever crazy story I tell myself uh, about my neighbor's intentions to kill me in 10 years. If I go over tomorrow and kill my neighbor, that's not justifiable because the goal that's achieved through that violence is not obvious. Right? The threat is not immediate, and the goal isn't clear. What's accomplished isn't clear. If the government goes and bombs uh, Iceland and says, "Well, we had to bomb Iceland because in 50 years the United States is going to be unlivably hot due to climate change, and we need a place that's unpopulated to move in 50 years." That would be unjustifiable, right? Because the goal that is to be achieved is far in the future. So generally, justification comes from immediacy. And this speaks generally to the purpose of power, right? Which is to maintain the current world. All right, so let's sum up a little bit here. Power should, wherever possible, refrain from using violence, because violence weakens it. It makes it less powerful. Where power uses violence, power is degraded. Power and violence are, in some sense, opposites in this way. Now, similarly, violence can never create power. However, violence does have the power, the ability, to destroy power. Violence can undo power. If the goal is to destroy a power, violence is useful. However, violence cannot replace power with anything else. Violence can destroy but cannot create power. Right? Only political action, collective action, agreement, persuasion, and opinion can create power. All right, so we'll leave it at that for today. And next lecture, we will look at section 3. Till then.